Welcome to the new episode of History of Revolution. How are you? Hope your week was fine. Today, we are undertaking, well, a truly massive deep dive. It's a mission really tailored specifically for you, the curious learner, who wants to understand the foundational structures of our modern world. We're trying to cut straight past the headlines, the surface level politics of today, to grasp the core economic forces, the ones that have really shaped global history for, what, the last century and a half?
That is absolutely right. Yeah, we're opening up your stack of sources here and diving into three colossal interconnected fields. Big ones.
Okay.
We start with the classical theories of imperialism, then we'll move to dependency theory, which is, well, it's crucial for understanding that enduring core-periphery relationship, even after formal colonialism supposedly ended.
Right, the neo-colonial aspect.
Exactly. And finally, we'll examine the practical, sometimes pretty messy lessons drawn from the major anti-colonial revolutions, think mid-20th century.
And this isn't just about, listing historical dates or events. The idea is to connect all the complex dots to show why the world is structured the way it is today. And to frame this entire discussion, I think we need to start with the most comprehensive analytical lens we have, right? The Marxist perspective on imperialism.
Precisely. Yeah, that's the starting point. It has to be. This fundamental insight. Imperialism isn't just a policy choice governments make.
Not just something they decide to do.
No.
No.
It is, as Lenin argued in his seminal work, Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, it's the necessary, unavoidable highest stage of capitalism itself.
Okay, highest stage. What does that imply?
It means that the material conditions inherent in capitalism, things like the constant pressure on profits, the relentless drive for expansion, they make the systematic domination and exploitation of peripheral nations an economic requirement.
A requirement, not just an opportunity.
A requirement. It's not some optional foreign policy adventure. It's the system's natural, logical conclusion when it reaches a certain level of development.
Okay, so let's travel back a bit. Turn of the 20th century. You've got the world's most advanced nations, Britain, France, Germany, suddenly engaged in this furious scramble, right? Carving up Africa, Asia, the Pacific.
Like a feeding frenzy.
And people at the time were debating, why. Why was this happening so aggressively right then? This is where the serious studies on imperialism begin, even slightly before the main Marxist tradition, with figures like J.A. Hobson in 1902.
Hobson's important, yeah. He wasn't a Marxist. He was looking for social reform within capitalism. But he was valuable because he described the phenomenon very clearly.
What did he see?
He linked all this overseas expansion to problems back home under consumption.
Yeah.
The need for new markets for all the surplus stuff being produced that people couldn't afford to buy.
Yeah.
But it was really the Marxist tradition, starting with Rudolf Hilferding around 1910, then Rosa Luxemburg in 1913, and finally Lenin in 1916, that provided the full-fledged, deep economic explanation. They went beyond just describing it.
And what was the core agreement there? What did they all fundamentally see as the driver?
They all agreed that this struggle for the division of the world, as Lenin called it, was driven by a desperate economic imperative. It boiled down to capital's relentless need to secure new avenues for profit.
Okay, so profits were falling at home.
Exactly. As returns diminished in the core, developed nations, capital had to find other places. It needed cheap land, secure sources of raw materials, access to abundant, incredibly cheap labor, and crucially, new markets to sell to, all to maintain its rate of profit. This need, this constant search for super profits, that's the engine.
And Lenin, you mentioned, he synthesized all these ideas in Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. He broke it down into 5 distinct economic features, right? You said these are like the blueprint.
Absolutely. They're interlocked, they build on each other. If you understand these 5 features, you really start to understand the economic logic of the 20th century, and honestly, much of today too. We should unpack these slowly, make sure they're clear.
Okay, let's do it. Feature number 1.
Feature number 1 is critical. The concentration of production and capital resulting in monopolies. So capitalism starts, at least in theory, with free competition. Lots of small firms competing.
The Adam Smith idea.
Right. But the inherent logic of competition itself means that bigger, more efficient firms survive. They innovate, they scale up, they drive down costs, and eventually they swallow or crush the smaller ones.
Survival of the fittest, economically speaking.
Pretty much. This natural process leads away from free competition and inevitably towards concentration. You end up with the monopolies. Think of cartels, syndicates, trusts, controlling whole sectors of the economy.
We definitely see that today. Big tech, energy giants, pharmaceuticals.
This is the same dynamic.
Yeah.
But Lenin was already seeing it starkly back then. He cited some pretty astounding statistics from the pre-World War I era.
Like what?
Well, for instance, in Germany, he pointed out that a tiny fraction of enterprises, just over 1%, 1.1% to be exact, were already responsible for producing almost half, 43.8% of the total industrial output.
Wow. So much power in so few hands.
Exactly. And when production gets concentrated like that, in the hands of just a handful of colossal enterprises, genuine competition basically vanishes. They don't need to undercut each other anymore. They can agree on prices. They can divide up markets, control output. Monopoly becomes the defining feature, replacing that earlier competitive phase.
Okay, so that concentration of industrial power, that leads us directly to the second feature, which you said was maybe the most revolutionary theoretical leap, the merging of bank and industrial capital.
Yes, this is absolutely definitive for the imperialist era. It's the birth of what Hilferding and Lenin called finance capital, and with it, the financial oligarchy.
How does that work? How do banks get involved?
Well, banks themselves also concentrate. They go from being just passive places holding deposits to becoming powerful monopolies in their own right. Because these huge industrial monopolies centralize vast amounts of cash flow, the banks controlling that cash gain enormous power.
They control the money supply, essentially.
They start to, yes.
Yeah.
And they begin to lend money not just for day-to-day operating costs, but for the fundamental expansion of industry itself, building new factories, major investments. And here's the key. A deep, almost incestuous connection gets established through what Lenin called the personal link-up.
Personal link-up.
Bank directors start sitting on the boards of industrial companies, and the industrial magnates, the factory owners, sit on the boards of the banks.
Ah, so the same small group of people are controlling both the factories and the banks.
Exactly. It's a handful of financial magnates who centralize control over the entire economy. They're not just profiting from making things anymore. They profit from controlling the credit system, floating loans, issuing stock, speculating.
They're extracting value from everywhere.
Right. Lenin, drawing heavily on Hilferding here, emphasized that this oligarchy extracts tribute upon the whole of society. They control the very mechanisms of economic life. They dictate where investment flows, who gets credit, who doesn't. They hold the reins.
Okay, so you have this massively concentrated industrial and financial power, this finance capital. It needs somewhere to go, right? Which leads to the third feature. The export of capital becoming exceptionally important, even more important than exporting actual goods.
This is the real pivot point for global expansion. Think about it. In earlier phases of capitalism, countries mostly exported finished goods. Textiles from Britain, machinery from Germany.
Right, selling stuff they made.
Under imperialism, the core countries start exporting money itself capital to build factories, mines, railways, ports overseas in less developed regions.
Why the shift? Why not just keep making stuff at home?
Because capital has become so abundant, so concentrated in the core countries, that there are fewer profitable investment opportunities left there. The rate of profit starts to fall. So, capital seeks out much higher returns, enormous super profits in these peripheral nations.
Where the costs are lower.
Exactly. Where land is dirt cheap, resources are untapped or easily seized, and crucially, labor is incredibly cheap and abundant, often unorganized and easily exploited.
And I imagine this export of capital isn't exactly a altruistic development aid. It's a tool of control, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's a deliberate tool for creating and maintaining economic dependence. The sources we looked at give clear historical examples.
Such as?
Like when powerful German financial groups granted loans to countries like, say, Romania or Argentina back then. Those loans almost always came with strings attached. Major strings.
Forced purchases.
You got it.
Okay.
The recipient nation was often forced to use the loan money to buy German railway materials or German armaments or German machinery, whether they were the best or cheapest option or not.
So the capital flows out as a loan, creates dependency, and then flows back to Germany as payment for German goods, plus interest.
Precisely. Layered with super profits from the loan and profits from the forced sales. It locks the dependent nation into the imperial power's economic orbit. It ensures long-term control long after the initial loan.
Okay, so when multiple core nations, Britain, France, Germany, the US, are all doing this at the same time, exporting capital, carving out spheres of influence, this leads to the fourth feature, the formation of international monopolist associations.
Right, it escalates. National monopolies, cartels, and trusts are no longer enough to manage the global competition. So these huge global financial groups and industrial monopolies start to collude internationally.
Dividing up the world market itself.
Yes, they make agreements amongst themselves. They decide, on an international level, who gets control of the diamond mines in South Africa, who controls the copper in Chile, or the oil fields in the Middle East, or the rubber plantations in Southeast Asia.
So they're minimizing competition between themselves on a global scale?
Trying to, yes, to maximize their collective extractive power over the entire globe. It's like a global carve-up by the biggest players.
Which brings us logically to the fifth and final feature. The territorial division of the world is completed, the political and geographical consequence of all this economic activity.
By the early 1900s, it was basically done. There was almost nowhere left on the map to plant a flag for the first time. The entire globe, virtually, had been mapped, claimed, annexed, or brought into spheres of influence by the major imperial powers.
Driven by that need for raw materials.
Absolutely. The quest for secure sources of raw materials, coal, iron, cotton, rubber, oil, you name it, and also for strategic military advantage, like naval bases, had fueled this feverish annexation, this scramble.
And once the world is fully divided, what happens then?
Well, that's the terrifying logic. Once the division is complete, the only way for rival imperial powers to expand their access to resources, markets, and profitable investment zones is to fight over the redivision of existing territories.
Taking colonies or spheres of influence from each other.
Exactly. This creates an intense zero-sum struggle. It makes inter-imperialist rivalry incredibly sharp and ultimately makes major wars like World War I, which broke out shortly after Lenin wrote this, not just likely, but according to this analysis, structurally inevitable.
Wow. Okay, that's a powerful framework from Lenin. Now, we also mentioned Rosa Luxemburg. Her analysis in the accumulation of capital from 1913 adds another critical layer, right? Focusing on something called the realization problem.
Yes, Luxemburg's contribution is crucial, though sometimes a bit complex for newcomers. Let's try to break it down carefully. It's about how capitalists actually make their profit real.
Realization, meaning turning the goods they produce back into money.
Exactly. So surplus value, the unpaid labor embodied in goods, the source of profit initially exists as commodities, finished products sitting in a warehouse. Capitalism needs to sell those surplus commodities to convert that value back into money. That money is then used for the capitalist's own consumption and, crucially, for reinvestment to expand production. That conversion process is realization.
Okay, makes sense. So what was Luxemburg's specific argument about this?
She looked closely at Marx's own models of economic reproduction. And she argued, controversially at the time, that within a purely capitalist system, one consisting only of capitalists buying labor power and workers selling it and buying necessities, there's a problem.
A demand problem.
Essentially, yes. She argued the aggregate demand from the workers, limited by their wages, and the limited consumption of the capitalists themselves wouldn't be enough to buy back all the surplus commodities produced, especially as technology makes production ever more efficient. There simply wouldn't be enough effective purchasing power within the closed capitalist circuit to realize the full amount of surplus value generated.
So the system can't actually buy back everything it produces on its own. It needs outside help.
That's precisely her point. Capitalism, in order to realize its surplus value and therefore continue the cycle of accumulation and expansion, literally needs buyers and markets outside its own self-contained system.
And where does it find them?
It needs to constantly interact with and ultimately absorb non-capitalist formations. These are societies, or parts of societies, still based on pre-capitalist economic forms. Think self-sufficient peasant agriculture, artisan production, communal economies, places not yet fully integrated into the wage labor system.
How do these non-capitalist areas help?
They serve a dual vital purpose for capital accumulation. First, they act as that crucial third market for the surplus commodities that can't be sold internally. This allows capital to convert its surplus value into money.
Okay, a place to dump excess goods.
Right. And second, simultaneously, these non-capitalist areas are essential sources of cheap raw materials and, very importantly, fresh reserves of labor power that can be forcibly dragged into the wage system as capitalism expands.
This sounds inherently violent. The interaction isn't peaceful trade, is it?
No, according to Luxemburg, it's fundamentally based on violence. Imperialism is the political expression of this economic need. It's the historical process by which capitalism expands, violently conquering, subjugating, and monetizing these pre-capitalist areas through, as she put it, force, fraud, oppression, and looting.
But here's the contradiction you mentioned earlier.
Yes. This is the systemic, self-destructive contradiction Luxemburg identified. In needing and consuming these non-capitalist structures, capitalism actively destroys the very formations it depends upon for its own realization and expansion.
It eats its own seed corn, so to speak.
In a way, yes. Once these non-capitalist environments are fully destroyed, once the entire world is finally and totally enclosed within the capitalist mode of production, the system loses its external outlet for surplus goods and its source of primitive accumulation. At that point, Luxemburg argued, capitalism faces its inevitable terminal crisis. It cannot continue to accumulate. This is her powerful argument against the possibility of capitalism achieving any kind of long-term, stable, continuous development. It inherently relies on destroying what's outside it, ensuring its own eventual doom.
Okay, so the classical theories, Lenin, Luxemburg, they powerfully explain the economic engine driving the creation of this global system of domination, this imperialism, up to World War I and beyond. But then, after World War II, something shifts politically. Dozens of former colonies gain formal political independence.
Right, the great wave of decolonization across Asia and Africa.
But the economic domination didn't just vanish, did it? Far from it. And this is where the next set of theories we need to discuss comes in. Dependency theory.
Exactly. Dependency theory, or DT, as it's often called, arose primarily in Latin America, starting around the 1950s and really developing through the 60s and 70s. It was a direct and quite aggressive challenge to the dominant modernization theories popular in the West during the Cold War.
Ah, yes, modernization theory. What was the basic idea there?
It was essentially this optimistic, rather simplistic view that, well, poor countries are just like Western countries, but delayed. They're just at an earlier stage of development.
Like kids who haven't grown up yet.
Kind of. The idea was they just needed the right inputs. Western capital investment, Western technology, Western aid, Western political institutions, and they would naturally follow the same linear path of development that Western Europe and North America supposedly took. They'd catch up.
And dependency theorists said,
They said, no, that's completely wrong. You're fundamentally misunderstanding the problem. They totally rejected this idea of linear stages.
so what was their alternative explanation? If it wasn't just being behind, what was it?
They argued the problem wasn't a lack of development or being stuck in an early stage. The problem was the specific way these countries were integrated into the global capitalist system. It was about the structure of their relationship with the dominant powers.
A structure created by that history of imperialism we just discussed.
Precisely. They viewed these peripheral economies, the former colonies, the dependent nations, not as being on an earlier rung of the same ladder, but as having a specific, historically conditioned formation shaped by centuries of colonialism and imperialist investment.
Okay, so the core concept is?
The core concept is that capitalism isn't just a collection of separate national economies. It's a single, integrated world system. And within this global system, there are structurally distinct and unequal roles. You have the core, the advanced industrialized nations, and the periphery, the dependent, usually resource-exporting nations.
And the relationship is unequal.
Inherently unequal. The system is structured so that the core extracts value, resources, and profit from the periphery. The periphery, in turn, provides those resources, provides cheap labor, and often serves as a market for the core's surplus capital and manufactured goods. Their relationship is defined by dependence, rooted directly in that history of imperialist penetration and investment. Underdevelopment in the periphery wasn't an original state. It was actively created by the development of the core.
Development and underdevelopment are two sides of the same coin.
Exactly. That was a key insight, particularly associated with Andre Gunter Frank, one of the dependency writers.
Now, you mentioned there were different schools of thought within dependency theory. We should probably distinguish those because they led to different conclusions about what to do. First, the structuralists, often linked to CIPOL, the UN body in Latin America.
Yes, the Latin American structuralists, heavily influenced by the early work of Raúl Prebisch back in the 1940s and 50s. Their analysis focused primarily on the structural imbalances in international trade.
The terms of trade argument.
That's the one. Prebisch and others argue that the prices of primary commodities, the raw materials exported by the periphery, tended to decline systematically over time relative to the prices of manufactured goods exported by the core. So, peripheral countries had to export more and more coffee or copper just to buy the same amount of tractors or machinery.
A built-in disadvantage?
Right. Analytically, they were often closer to Keynesian economic ideas than pure Marxism. They focused on concepts like effective demand within the national economy, bottlenecks in production, things like that.
And their solution wasn't necessarily revolution, was it? It was more about state intervention.
Correct. Their prescription for overcoming this dependency was primarily through state-led development. Specifically, a policy called Import Substitution Industrialization, or ISI.
Building up national industries.
Exactly. The idea was to use state power, high tariffs, subsidies, and direct investment to build up domestic industries to produce the manufactured goods that were previously being imported, shield the national economy from the negative terms of trade and the volatility of the world market dominated by the core, gain some measure of economic autonomy. It was fundamentally about reform within a capitalist framework, aiming for a more managed, nationally oriented capitalism.
Okay, so that's the structuralist school. Then came the second wave, the neo-Marxists, often called Dependency Theory, more radical.
Much more radical, yes. This stream emerged strongly in the late 1960s and early 70s, featuring major thinkers like Samir Amin from Egypt, Rui Mauro Marini from Brazil, Teotonio dos Santos, Vânia Babira. They drew much more directly on the classical Marxist theories of imperialism we discussed, Lenin, Baron.
And they were critical of the structuralists.
Very critical. They argued that the structuralists' focus on trade imbalances was too narrow and that their solution, ISI, ultimately wouldn't work. Why? Because it failed to challenge the fundamental capitalist system and, crucially, the mechanisms of value extraction that operated beyond just trade.
So how did the neo-Marxists define dependency differently? What was the core mechanism for them?
They used core, fundamental Marxist categories: surplus value, exploitation, class formation, the mode of production. They argue that dependency wasn't just about unfavorable trade prices. It was maintained through the active transfer of surplus value from the periphery to the core.
How is value transferred?
Through various mechanisms. One key one they highlighted was unequal exchange, where labor in the periphery, despite potentially being very productive, is paid significantly less relative to the value it creates compared to labor in the core. This allows core countries to acquire goods from the periphery, embodying more labor time, for goods embodying less labor time. Other mechanisms included profit repatriation by multinational corporations, interest payments on debt, brain drain.
A systematic siphoning off of wealth.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A systematic impoverishment. And crucially, they argued this wasn't just an external relationship. It deeply shaped the internal class structure of the dependent nations. The local ruling class, the national bourgeoisie, wasn't a potential engine for independent development as the structuralists sometimes hoped.
Why not?
Because, the neo-Marxists argued, the local bourgeoisie's own wealth and power were inextricably linked to their role as junior partners or intermediaries for foreign finance capital. They benefited from the dependent structure. Therefore, overcoming dependency required not just state intervention, but a revolutionary fundamental break with the world capitalist system and the overthrow of these comprador ruling classes.
Yeah, a much more radical conclusion.
Absolutely.
Now, this whole debate was raging in the 60s and 70s, but then, as you mentioned, the global political and economic climate shifted dramatically with the rise of neoliberalism in the 80s.
Yes, the Washington Consensus's era. Neoliberalism aggressively championed more integration into the world market, free trade, privatization, deregulation, basically the exact opposite of what dependency theory, especially the ISI version, advocated.
Did that kill dependency theory?
Well, it certainly marginalized it in mainstream academic and policy circles for a while. Neoliberalism became the dominant ideology. Concepts emerged like associated dependent development, which tried to argue that countries could somehow benefit from deeper integration with foreign capital, even while remaining structurally dependent. But DT didn't disappear, and its core methodology, I think, remains incredibly relevant today.
How so? How does the theory from the 60s and 70s help us analyze today's globalized world?
Because DT teaches us to combine two things: a historical structural analysis of the global core-periphery relationship and deep, concrete analysis of how those global forces interact with country-specific socioeconomic formations, class structures, and state policies. It gives you a framework for seeing the connections.
And we see new forms of dependency today.
Absolutely. The mechanisms might look different, but the underlying structure persists. Think about financialization, how volatile flows of speculative international capital can completely destabilize or discipline national economies in the periphery. Think about global value chains, GVCs.
The way products are made across many countries now.
Right. GVCs often ensure that the high-value activities, research, design, branding, finance, profit-taking, stay firmly located in the core countries, while the low-value, labor-intensive, often polluting manufacturing stages are outsourced to the periphery, where wages are low and regulations are weak. Value is still being systematically transferred.
And the third one you mentioned.
The commodification of knowledge and information. Intellectual property rights, controlled by corporations mainly in the core, become another huge source of rent and control, hindering technological development in the periphery. Dependency theory provides the analytical tools to see how these modern mechanisms perpetuate that core-periphery dynamic, that unequal relationship. And critically, it helps us analyze how local ruling classes in the periphery often benefit from managing these connections, acting as the local partners for global finance capital.
So the fundamental conclusion remains the same, even if the tools look shinier.
I think so. The fundamental argument against capitalism and imperialism holds strong. On a capitalist basis, whether it's the old industrial model or the new financialized GVC model, there is no genuine, sustainable path to self-determined economic development and broad-based prosperity for the masses in the dependent countries. They remain structurally chained to the demands and dynamics of the imperialist core.
By the way, if you liked and interested so far, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. It's really important for us to continue this series. Okay, so we've traced the economic theories from classical imperialism explaining the system's creation to dependency theory explaining its persistence after formal colonialism. Now let's shift focus a bit, moving from the abstract theory to concrete revolutionary action on the ground. The post-World War II period, say from 1945 onwards, was absolutely dominated by mass struggles against this imperialist system, right? Across Asia, Africa, Latin America.
Absolutely. It was an era of tremendous revolutionary upheaval. We're talking about massive, often armed resistance movements in places like Vietnam, China, Cuba, Algeria, Yemen, Angola, Mozambique. The list goes on and on.
And many of these struggles, they didn't necessarily start out demanding socialism, did they? What were the initial goals?
Often, the initial demands were what Marxists would classify as classic bourgeois democratic tasks. Things like getting rid of the foreign colonial power, achieving national independence and sovereignty, and, very frequently, carrying out land reform, breaking up large feudal or foreign-owned estates and distributing land to the peasants who worked it.
But the historical record shows these movements didn't just stop there, did they? They often went much further, much faster.
That's a key point. Many of these struggles, even if they started with nationalist or democratic goals, found themselves swinging sharply to the left very quickly. They rapidly moved towards expropriating not just foreign capital, but also local capitalists allied with imperialism and adopting explicitly socialist policies, aligning themselves with the Soviet bloc or China.
And this dynamic, this tendency for the democratic revolution to grow over into a socialist one in these contexts, is where Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution becomes relevant again, isn't it?
Yes, it's highly relevant to understanding this period. Trotsky had argued, based initially on the Russian experience, that in backward dependent countries dominated by imperialism, the local national bourgeoisie, the native capitalist class, is fundamentally too weak, too fearful of its own working class, and too financially intertwined with foreign imperialist interests to ever truly lead and complete its own democratic revolution. Land reform, national unity, democracy.
They're compromised from the start.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
They might talk about independence, but they shy away from any measures that truly threaten property relations or imperialist dominance. Therefore, Trotsky argued, the task of achieving even basic democratic goals like land reform and genuine national sovereignty falls necessarily to the working class, often in alliance with the peasantry.
And in taking power to achieve those democratic tasks.
They are immediately forced by the resistance of the old order and imperialism to go further, to implement socialist measures, like nationalizing industry, to consolidate their rule and defend the revolution. The revolution becomes permanent in the sense that it doesn't stop at the bourgeois democratic stage, but is compelled to move uninterruptedly towards socialist tasks under the leadership of the working class.
Okay, that theory provides one lens, but then history throws up curveballs. The Cuban Revolution in 1959, its success, presented a major theoretical puzzle, a paradox, for many Marxists at the time. Let's look at the analysis from 1960 you mentioned, by thinkers like Mage, Wohlforth, Robertson. What was the paradox?
The Cuban paradox was this. Here you had a profound social revolution. It achieved sweeping land reform, it expropriated vast amounts of U.S.-owned capital, especially in the sugar industry, it dismantled the old Batista dictatorship and its state apparatus, it mobilized the masses. Truly revolutionary changes. But it achieved all this without what were previously considered the essential prerequisites according to most Marxist theory, particularly the Trotskyist version of permanent revolution.
Which were?
Specifically, the revolution lacked the direct conscious, organized leadership of a revolutionary socialist party rooted in the urban working class. And it wasn't primarily based on the autonomous, independent action of the organized urban proletariat taking power.
Who led it then, and who supported it?
The leadership came primarily from radicalized middle-class figures, intellectuals, and guerrilla fighters, led by Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. And their crucial base of mass support, especially in the guerrilla phase, was the peasantry in the mountains, who desperately wanted land and an end to the corrupt regime. The urban working class played a role, but not the leading independent political role expected by theory.
That really does fly in the face of decades of Marxist analysis that stressed the unique leading role of the proletariat due to its position in production. So why did the revolution succeed and go so far left without that traditional leadership?
The analysis at the time focused on the objective conditions. The immediate burning tasks facing Cuba were modernization, ending the brutal dictatorship, achieving genuine national independence from overwhelming U.S. economic control, and land redistribution. Crucially, the Cuban economy was almost entirely a U.S.-dominated sugar monoculture.
So any real change meant confronting U.S. capital head-on.
Exactly. To achieve genuine land reform meant seizing the massive plantations owned by American sugar companies. To achieve genuine independence meant breaking free from U.S. economic strangulation. The moment the new revolutionary government, led by Castro, actually started to implement the democratic demands of the masses, especially land reform, they were forced into a direct, unavoidable, and ultimately violent conflict with U.S. imperialism.
Washington wouldn't tolerate it.
Absolutely not. The U.S. response was immediate hostility, embargo, attempts at invasion. This intense external pressure, this clash with imperialism, automatically pushed the revolution further leftward. It forced Castro's government towards more radical expropriations of U.S. and Cuban capital, towards seeking aid from the Soviet Union, and towards adopting socialist measures, arguably regardless of the leadership's initial ideological blueprints.
So the objective clash with imperialism drove the radicalization.
That was the core of the analysis. The conclusion drawn by many Marxists studying it in 1960 was that the Cuban Revolution was transitional and open. Its final class character wasn't yet definitively settled by history.
Yeah.
It was fundamentally driven by the anti-imperialist and agrarian tasks, and its future path depended heavily on whether it could break its isolation and spark wider revolutions, especially in Latin America.
Okay, a very different dynamic compared to, say, the Chinese Revolution, which had a much more elaborate theoretical preparation. Let's contrast Cuba with the framework laid out by Mao Zedong in China, particularly his concept of the two-stage revolution in his work on New Democracy.
Right. Mao, leading the Chinese Communist Party through decades of struggle, developed a very distinct strategic framework. He argued that the revolutionary process in a semi-colonial, semi-feudal country like China had to proceed through two distinct, though connected, stages.
Stage one.
Stage one was the bourgeois democratic revolution, but of a new type which he termed the New Democracy. Only after this stage was successfully completed could China move to the second stage, the socialist revolution.
What made it a new democracy? What was new about it compared to, say, the French Revolution?
For Mao, the great historical watershed that fundamentally changed the nature of all colonial and semi-colonial revolutions was the Russian October Revolution of 1917.
How did 1917 change things globally for these movements?
Before 1917, Mao argued, revolutions in the colonies were considered part of the old world bourgeois democratic revolution, led by the bourgeoisie. After 1917, with the emergence of a socialist state, the Soviet Union, and a global communist movement, any revolution in a colony or semi-colony against imperialism automatically became part of and an ally of the proletarian socialist world revolution.
Even if its immediate goals were democratic, not socialist.
Yes, its international alignment and its enemy, imperialism, made it objectively part of the world's socialist struggle. Therefore, the political goal of this first stage, the new democratic revolution, was not to establish a traditional capitalist state ruled solely by the national bourgeoisie. Mao viewed the Chinese national bourgeoisie as too prone to compromising with imperialism and feudalism.
So who was meant to rule in this new democratic republic?
It was conceived as a joint dictatorship of several revolutionary classes, united under the leadership of the proletariat, represented by the Communist Party. This alliance would include the proletariat, the vast peasantry, the urban petite bourgeoisie, small shopkeepers, intellectuals, students, and even certain sections of the national bourgeoisie who were deemed patriotic and anti-imperialist.
An alliance against common enemies.
Exactly. United to oppose the two main enemies, foreign imperialism and domestic feudalism, landlordism. This state would carry out land reform, build national industry, and secure independence, but it would be neither a purely bourgeois state nor yet a fully socialist state. It was seen as a necessary transitional stage, paving the way for the future transition to socialism under proletarian leadership.
And this placed enormous emphasis on the peasantry, didn't it, given China's demographics?
Immense emphasis. You have to remember, China was overwhelmingly peasant. Stalin actually commented on this in 1925, stating that for countries like China, the national and colonial question is, in essence, the question of the peasantry. Mobilizing, organizing, and leading the peasant masses was absolutely central to the Chinese Communist Party's strategy for achieving the new democratic revolution. Now, if we shift continents again from Asia to Africa and look at the Algerian War of Independence against France, we encounter the searing analysis of Frantz Fanon. His book, The Wretched of the Earth, published in 1961, added a crucial and deeply controversial dimension concerning the psychology, the culture, and the very mechanics of liberation from colonialism.
Fanon is perhaps most famous or infamous for his arguments about violence. Why did he see violence as so central, so necessary?
Fanon, who was trained as a psychiatrist and worked with victims of colonial torture in Algeria, had a unique perspective. He argued that colonialism isn't just political or economic oppression, it's violence in its natural state. It operates through constant systemic violence, physical, psychological, cultural pace that degrades the colonized person, destroys their culture, and instills a deep sense of inferiority and dehumanization.
So counterviolence is a response.
More than just a response. Fanon saw revolutionary violence by the colonized as a necessary cleansing force. He argued it was essential not just for political liberation, but for mental and psychological emancipation. The act of fighting back, of meeting the colonizers' violence with violence was, in his view, what frees the native from their inferiority complex, restores their self-respect, binds the oppressed people together in solidarity, and makes them historical actors again.
A very powerful and challenging psychological argument. He also made a very controversial theoretical point that seemed to challenge the traditional Marxist model of base and superstructure, the idea that the economic base determines the political and ideological superstructure.
Yes, this is one of Fanon's most debated contributions found in Wretched of the Earth. He argued that in the specific context of the colony, the standard Marxist analysis needed to be slightly stretched. He famously stated, in the colonies, the economic substructure is also a superstructure. The cause is the consequence. You are rich because you are white. You are white because you are rich.
What does that mean, exactly? The economic is the superstructure.
He meant that in the stark Manichaean world of the colony, the division isn't primarily hidden behind complex economic relations like wage labor, as it might be in the metropole. The division is immediate, visible, and racial. Your economic position, being exploited poor, landless, is directly and visibly determined by your race, being black, Arab, colonized. The superstructural category of race functions as the direct organizing principle of the economic base. They are seamlessly mirrored, intertwined in a way that's different from the core capitalist countries. Economic reality and race are almost fused. Inequality is immediate, overt, and fundamentally racialized.
And this profound observation, this unique analysis of the colonial situation, led him to a class analysis that was, well, truly challenging, even shocking to traditional Marxists. Who did he see as the revolutionary actors?
This is where Fanon really departs. Most shocking, perhaps, was his view of the urban, organized working class in the colonies, the proletariat.
The group usually seen as the vanguard.
Exactly. Fanon, based on his observations, particularly in Algeria, viewed the relatively small colonial proletariat, the skilled workers, the miners, the dock workers, the civil servants, as potentially counter-revolutionary. He argued they were actually a comparatively privileged stratum within the colonized population.
Privileged how?
They had relatively stable jobs, slightly higher wages, maybe some union rights. They were, in a sense, pampered by the colonial system because their labor was necessary for the colonial economy, ports, mines, transport, to function smoothly. Fanon argued they had more to lose from a total revolutionary upheaval. He saw them as often having a bourgeois mentality, more interested in taking the place of the European workers within the existing system than in overthrowing the system itself.
Wow. Okay, so if the established working class was potentially compromised, who did Fanon pin his hopes on? Who were the truly revolutionary forces in the colony?
He looked to the sections of the population who were completely marginalized, living outside the structures of the colonial economy, and therefore had absolutely nothing to lose and everything to gain from its destruction. Primarily the peasantry, the landless, deeply exploited rural masses who bore the brunt of colonial dispossession.
Then also,
And also, very controversially, the lumpen proletariat. This is Marx's term for the D-class A elements, the vagabonds, the long-term unemployed in the shantytowns, the petty criminals, prostitutes, the permanently marginalized. Fanon saw this group precisely because they were outside the system and often responded to colonialism with spontaneous violence as possessing a raw, untapped revolutionary potential. He believed these groups, the peasantry and the lumpen proletariat, unschooled in colonial ideology and driven by desperation, were the most fertile ground for revolutionary consciousness and action.
that's a stark contrast to traditional Marxism, which generally viewed the lumpen proletariat with deep suspicion as unreliable and potentially reactionary, and always emphasized the organized proletariat's leading role due to its collective power at the point of production.
A very stark contrast indeed. Fanon's class analysis remains one of the most debated aspects of his work.
Hey, listener, do you have any other idea or question about this? Please write in comments.
Fanon's intense focus on race and culture as the immediate reality of colonial oppression, and his questioning of the traditional revolutionary role of the colonized proletariat arguably paved the way, or at least provided some intellectual ammunition, for later academic trends that emerged decades later, particularly the rise of postcolonial theory.
Right. Postcolonialism, which became very influential in Western universities from the 1980s onwards. And one of its core tenets, or at least a strong tendency within it, is the assertion that the whole framework of class struggle, derived from Marx, is somehow Eurocentric. That it's a Western concept that doesn't really fit the supposedly unique cultural and racial dynamics of the non-Western world, the global South. The foundational text often cited here is Edward Said's Orientalism from 1978.
Said's Orientalism was a landmark work, absolutely essential. Its great contribution was to meticulously expose the deep-seated, often unconscious racism, ethnocentrism, and crude stereotypes embedded in centuries of Western academic writing, literature, and art about the Orient, the Middle East, Asia.
How the West defined itself by creating an other.
Exactly. He showed how the West constructed its own identity as rational, progressive, and superior by portraying the Orient as its opposite, irrational, stagnant, sensual, mysterious, and inferior. This Orientalist discourse, he argued, served to justify Western colonial domination. It was a brilliant critique of cultural power.
But where does the criticism, especially from Marxists, come in?
The criticism, particularly from Marxist perspectives, is that Said, having exposed Western cultural biases, then tended to make his own sweeping generalization. He often painted the entire West, its culture, its intellectual traditions, including the Enlightenment and even Marxism itself, as being inherently tainted by this Orientalist, ethnocentric perspective. This effectively lumped the Western working class and its own revolutionary traditions into the same reactionary cultural bloc as the imperialist rulers.
It flattened the internal class contradictions within the West.
That's the argument. It risked ignoring the struggles within the West against capitalism and imperialism and presented the West as a monolithic cultural entity. The key theoretical shift that critics point to in much post-colonial theory that followed Said is philosophical.
Oh, so?
There's a tendency to elevate culture, identity, and discourse, language representation, to become the primary driving forces of history. This moves away from the materialist analysis central to Marxism, which focuses on economic structures, class relations, modes of production, and towards what Marxists call philosophical idealism.
Meaning ideas determine reality, rather than material conditions shaping ideas.
In essence, yes. Instead of analyzing how, say, finance capital's need for superprofits, material waste, leads to imperialist wars and racist ideologies, superstructure, the focus shifts heavily onto how Western ways of thinking, Western texts, or Western language construct the reality of domination. While cultural analysis is vital, the danger is losing sight of the underlying economic engine.
And we see the most extreme expressions of this idealism in figures like Dipesh Chakrabarty, whom you mentioned in the sources.
Yes, Chakrabarty's work, particularly his book Provincializing Europe, is often cited as an example of this trend taken to an extreme. He actively questions the universality of concepts like history, development, progress, and even scientific laws, suggesting they are inherently European constructs.
Rejecting the idea that economic laws like the tendency for the rate of profit to fall or the need for capital accumulation apply everywhere.
Pretty much. Chakrabarty introduces concepts like difference and multiple time worlds coexisting. He implies that the secular, supposedly disenchanted world of Europe and the West might operate according to certain laws of development and rationality, but other parts of the world operate differently. He controversially suggested, for example, that in understanding certain peasant actions in India, one might need to accept that for them the world is enchanted, that gods and spirits are real actors existing outside the laws governing the Western world.
That sounds problematic. It risks romanticizing poverty and pre-scientific beliefs, what the outline called fetishizing backwardness.
It's viewed by Marxist critics as profoundly reactionary, yes. This kind of hostility towards the ideas of universal progress, industrial development, and scientific rationality, and the corresponding idealization of religion, local traditions, mysticism, or tribalism, simply because they are non-Western, can be dangerous.
Why dangerous?
Because it risks echoing the rhetoric of the most backward-looking forces, religious fundamentalists, tribal chauvinists, who also reject Western modernity in favor of supposedly pure traditions. It also mirrors, ironically, the tactics often used by imperial powers themselves.
How so?
Imperial powers often deliberately emphasized and exploited religious, ethnic, and tribal differences within colonized societies, think divide and rule. They often propped up traditional feudal or religious leaders against modernizing nationalist movements. This post-colonial focus on insurmountable difference and cultural uniqueness, if taken too far at the expense of analyzing shared economic exploitation, risks serving the same divisive function, undermining the potential for broad, united struggle based on common class interests.
Okay, so given these critiques of idealism and the potential dangers of overemphasizing cultural difference, how do Marxists firmly reaffirm the materialist foundation when analyzing the undeniable realities of race and racism without falling into those traps?
The key is to return to the core materialist understanding. Race and racism are not primordial, independent forces driving history. They are fundamentally political and ideological tools. They are weapons, incredibly powerful weapons, wielded by the ruling class, particularly the imperialist bourgeoisie, to achieve specific material ends.
Primarily to divide the oppressed.
Primarily to divide the working class and the oppressed masses, both within the imperialist home countries and globally. Marx analyzed this brilliantly regarding the relationship between British and Irish workers in the 19th century. He showed how the British ruling class deliberately stoked national prejudice and racism against the Irish immigrants in England. Why? To prevent the British and Irish workers, who shared a common class enemy, from uniting. This division allowed the British bourgeoisie to maintain its exploitation of both groups more easily. Racism serves to obscure the real economic relations and prevent solidarity.
So race is a superstructural tool used to maintain the economic base of exploitation.
Precisely. It has devastating material consequences, shapes people's lives profoundly, but its origin and function are rooted in the material interests of the ruling class in maintaining its system of exploitation.
And therefore, the ultimate danger of postcolonial theory when it emphasizes cultural difference to the point of dismissing universal class struggle as Eurocentric is what?
The danger, from a Marxist standpoint, is that it logically rules out, or at least undermines, the possibility and necessity of united international struggle against imperialism and capitalism.
Why is international unity so crucial?
Because imperialism, as Lenin showed, is not a national phenomenon. It's an international system of financial control, resource extraction, and exploitation. Global capitalism is a global system. It can only be effectively challenged and ultimately overthrown by a united movement of the exploited and oppressed across national, racial, and cultural boundaries. By overemphasizing difference and dismissing class as universal, postcolonialism can inadvertently play into the hands of imperialism by fragmenting the opposition.
And it undermines the role of the working class.
It risks doing so, yes. While acknowledging the complexities and the betrayals that Fanon pointed to, the fundamental Marxist perspective remains that only the working class, due to its position in production, its potential collective power, and its interest in abolishing exploitation altogether, can ultimately lead the struggle for liberation. And critically, this includes uniting workers in the core countries with the struggles of the oppressed in the periphery. The local national bourgeoisie in dependent countries, as Fanon himself correctly observed, even with his different class analysis, is generally too treacherous, too tied to foreign capital to lead a genuine anti-imperialist revolution. Only the working class, by placing itself at the head of all the oppressed layers of the nation, has the potential to break the chains of imperialist domination definitively.
Okay, let's try to synthesize this incredibly rich and complex journey we've taken today. We started by establishing that imperialism isn't just a policy, but the highest, unavoidable stage of capitalism, driven by the deep economic needs of finance capital, as outlined by Lenin, And the realization problem highlighted by Rosa Luxemburg. It's baked into the system at a certain stage.
Right. And we saw how that structural reality didn't just disappear with flags and independence ceremonies. It created a permanent state of economic dependence for the periphery, a core-periphery relationship analyzed and formalized by dependency theory, both the structuralist and neo-Marxist schools, which shows how modern mechanisms like financialization and global value chains continue to perpetuate this fundamental inequality, decades after formal colonialism ended.
Then we moved from theory to practice, exploring the incredibly complex and often paradoxical realities of anti-colonial revolution in the mid-20th century. We looked at the Cuban experience, a profound revolution happening without the expected leadership, driven by the clash with U.S. imperialism, and contrasted that with the meticulous two-stage strategy of Mao's New Democracy in China, emphasizing the peasantry and the anti-imperialist alliance.
And we grappled with Fanon's searing insights from Algeria, the psychological necessity of violence as a cleansing force, the provocative idea of the economic base being a superstructure in the colony due to the immediacy of race, and his controversial critique of the colonial proletariat versus his championing of the peasantry and lumpen proletariat as the truly revolutionary forces.
Finally, we tackled the contemporary ideological struggle, examining how postcolonial theory, while offering vital critiques of Western cultural biases, like Orientalism, risks falling into philosophical idealism. By prioritizing culture and difference over material analysis and sometimes dismissing class struggle as Eurocentric, it can inadvertently undermine the potential for the united international struggle needed to defeat the global system of imperialism.
Exactly. We reaffirmed the Marxist materialist perspective. Race and racism are powerful tools used by the ruling class to divide the oppressed, but the fundamental engine remains the capitalist drive for profit and accumulation, which necessitates imperialism.
So, the unavoidable truth, the thread running through all these different analyses, from Lenin to Fanon to the dependency theorists, seems to be this. On a capitalist basis, there really is no way out, no genuine path to self-determined development, lasting peace, or an end to systemic poverty for the masses in the dependent nations. They remain chained to the global system of imperialism, mediated through finance capital and often their own treacherous local ruling classes who act as intermediaries.
That's the stark conclusion these analyses point towards. True economic development, the kind that actually benefits the majority, genuine liberation from the barbarism of poverty, exploitation, and war. These seem inextricably linked to breaking with that system. The only path forward, as consistently argued from this Marxist analytical perspective across these varied sources, lies beyond capitalism. It lies in the world's socialist revolution, a struggle that must unite the working class and oppress peoples internationally against their common enemy, the global capitalist system and its imperialist structures.
A challenging but necessary perspective to consider. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. See you on next episode, comrades. Bye-bye.